The wind howls with the voice of 1,000 angry gods, hammering snow and shards of ice against the wooden walls of the longhouse. Outside, the landscape has vanished beneath a storm that feels eternal, a white, roaring void where direction, colour and hope all dissolve into one. Inside, 40 souls pressed together in the dark, breathing the same thick air. The only light comes from the hearth at the centre of the hall, where a flame flickers like the last heartbeat of the world. A child whimpers from hunger. An old man coughs from smoke that stings the eyes and burns the throat. The rafters are black with soot. The air tastes of ash, wool, and fear. Beyond the door, the world is locked in ice, 30 degrees below freezing and still falling. The sun hasn't truly risen for weeks. It only brushes the horizon for a brief, teasing moment before abandoning the earth to darkness once more. This is not the end of the world. This is just another Tuesday in Viking Age Scandinavia. Could you survive 6 months of this? Most modern humans, softened by central heating, electric light and supermarkets stocked with strawberries in midwinter, wouldn't last a week. Yet for nearly 3 centuries, between 800 and 1100 CE, the Norse not only endured these conditions, they thrived under them. They built a civilization that reached from the Arctic Circle to North America, forging one of the most formidable cultures in human history out of cold darkness and scarcity. But the Vikings weren't gods or monsters. They were people of flesh, bone and will. Human beings who woke up every morning to a world that tried to kill them. What made them extraordinary wasn't strength alone, but their relationship with hardship. They didn't merely resist suffering, they shaped their identity around it. Each generation was trained by the previous one in the ancient art of endurance. Children learned early that pain was information, not tragedy. Adults are measured not by wealth or beauty, but by how much cold they could take without complaint. The North itself became their teacher, a god that demanded reverence, obedience and sacrifice in exchange for survival. What happens to a people when winter isn't a season, but a religion? Archaeologists and climatologists now know the Viking world was forged during one of Earth's harshest eras. Ice cores from Greenland reveal evidence of multiple micro-ice ages, periods when volcanic ash dimmed the sun and froze the growing seasons. Entire harvests failed, livestock died in barns, families vanished beneath snowdrifts that never melted. Out of this crucible, the Norse carved their destiny. When the rest of Europe shivered behind stone walls, the people of the North learned to turn adversity into art. Their myths, their architecture, even their spirituality, all were responses to the same relentless question. How do you keep living when nature itself wants you dead? The answer begins not in battlefields or longships, but here, in the suffocating dark of winter. For the Vikings, survival was not a passive state. It was an act of creation. They invented ways to outwit hunger, to trap heat, to stretch hope through months without sunlight. They built communities that turned endurance into meaning, and meaning into strength. The question isn't just how they survived, it's what they became because of it. To understand the Vikings, you have to step into their darkness, into a world where death was never more than a few heartbeats away, where the boundary between courage and despair blurred with every passing night. This is the story of how they endured when everything in nature conspired to end them, and what their survival reveals about the limits and the power of the human spirit. The darkness came first, long before the hunger, before the cold sank its teeth into bone. The sun itself disappeared. By late October in northern Scandinavia, daylight was a ghost, rising only to mock those who still waited for warmth. For a few trembling hours each day, the horizon glowed dull red like an open wound, then fell again into endless night. Imagine waking up and never seeing the sun again. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months. By December, the world around Trondheim and Lofoten ceased to have days at all. The sun didn't rise, it merely remembered rising. The land existed in a half-dream of perpetual twilight, a world where the human mind began to blur time itself. Modern people, wrapped in the comfort of electric light, can't truly imagine what that does to the brain. In the Viking world, the dark wasn't a mood, it was a weapon. It crept into thought, pressed against the skull like weight, whispering doubt and madness. Winter is coming. To the Norse, that wasn't a warning, it was a prophecy. And everyone knew it would come sooner than they wished, and stay longer than they could bear. The entire year was a countdown to that slow-motion disaster. Months of back-breaking labour were devoted not to progress, but to preparation for survival. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia proved the scale of this annual war against nature. At Borg in the Lofoten Islands, massive underground storage pits have been uncovered. Vaults capable of holding half a year's provisions. These were not signs of prosperity, they were monuments to fear. Every plank of timber, every dried fish, every grain of barley stored in those pits was an act of defiance against extinction. The Vikings didn't plan for winter, they planned for catastrophe, and catastrophe came often. Climate records preserved in the Greenland ice sheet show brutal fluctuations in temperature, so-called micro-ice ages. The most infamous occurred around 536 CE, when a veil of volcanic ash dimmed the sun for nearly 2 years. Crops failed across Europe, forests withered, people starved beneath a grey sky. The Norse would later call this the Fimbul Winter, the mighty winter that heralded Ragnarok, the end of all things. By the time the Viking Age truly dawned around 800 CE, that ancestral memory still haunted them. Temperatures in coastal Norway hovered near minus 10 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. On a good day, plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, during cold snaps. Inland Sweden and Norway regularly fell to minus 40 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold so vicious that breath crystallised mid-air, and unguarded flesh died in minutes. But cold alone didn't make the north unlivable. It was the combination of enemies, darkness, wind, hunger, isolation, that turned the Viking homeland into a test designed by the gods themselves. The sea, their usual highway of trade and war, betrayed them each year. Ice crept from the shore like invading armies, choking fjords, freezing boats in place. Excavations of coastal settlements show abandonment layers where entire villages simply gave up when the sea froze too far out. Snow was its own kind of siege. Drifts rose higher than rooftops, swallowing paths and fences. At Birka in Sweden, archaeologists found the remains of human-sized trenches, corridors hacked through snow walls taller than a man. Imagine every trip to fetch water or firewood becoming a march through frozen tunnels. Wind compounded it all. The fjords funneled gales that could peel the skin from a man's face. Winter storms weren't poetic exaggerations, they were acts of destruction. The sagas describe winds that ripped the roofs from halls and swallowed ships whole, and meteorologists now know they were right. North Atlantic lows can create hurricane-force gusts and 20-metre waves even today. And still the worst enemy was scarcity. Soil analysis and pollen data reveal that Viking agriculture balanced forever on the edge of collapse. A short summer or single failed harvest meant starvation. In human bones from the era, scientists have found Harris lines, bands of halted growth caused by severe malnutrition. Those lines appear again and again, winter after winter, even in well-fed communities. Every Viking carried winter inside their bones. Forests that once fed their fires became impassable. Rivers froze solid, locking trade and travel. Even the ground itself turned to iron. They couldn't dig graves for the dead. Bodies had to wait in barns or sheds until the thaw returned. Death didn't vanish in winter. It lingered frozen, staring back at the living. Yet somehow the Norse didn't just survive this environment, they embraced it. Winter became the rhythm of their culture. Feast and famine, darkness and rebirth, silence and song. In the long months of confinement, they forged the psychological steel that would later carry them across oceans. To understand their power, you have to understand their darkness. Winter wasn't the pause between seasons. It was the season, the crucible that defined who lived and who perished. And at the heart of that crucible stood humanity's greatest invention against the cold, the Viking longhouse, a furnace of flesh, fire, and faith where the species itself was re-engineered for endurance. The wooden door groans open, spilling a single streak of white light into the blackness. For a moment, the outside world intrudes, a blizzard of snow and wind howling like a living thing. Then the door slams shut, sealed with clay and moss, and the storm becomes a memory. Inside, 40 people and several animals breathe the same heavy air. The longhouse creaks as if it's alive, its timbers bending under snow and ice. The smoke from the hearth curls upward into the rafters, turning the air thick and dim. The longhouse wasn't just shelter, it was a survival engine. Here, humans and beasts shared warmth, breath, and fate. The structure itself was a masterpiece of adaptation, a weapon built against the cold, refined over generations by trial, death, and necessity. Excavations across Scandinavia, from Iceland to Norway to Denmark, reveal a stunning truth. Every beam and wall of these halls was engineered not for beauty, but for endurance. At Borg in the Lofoten Islands stands the largest Viking longhouse ever unearthed, over 80 metres long, built like the spine of a whale. Its curved walls didn't just look elegant, they fought the wind, deflecting it upward and away. Its elongated body minimised the surface exposed to the elements, trapping as much heat as possible. Long before modern architects spoke of thermal efficiency, Viking builders were already masters of it. Every plank was a calculation, every shape a line of defence against death. At the heart of the longhouse blazed the Langelder, the long fire. It wasn't a mere fireplace, it was the soul of the house, the line of light that divided warmth from oblivion. The hearth was deliberately low, allowing heat to spread slowly, wrapping the room like a blanket. The smoke didn't escape easily. It lingered beneath the roof beams, forming what archaeologists now call a smoke ceiling. That layer trapped warmth, preserved meat hanging from hooks, and killed the parasites that might have infested the thatch. The cost of this ingenious design: constant coughing, streaming eyes, and lungs blackened by soot. Human skeletons found in Norse burial sites tell the story. Their ribs are marked by chronic respiratory strain. Their eye sockets show damage from smoke irritation. Yet they endured it willingly, because that same smoke was the barrier between life and frostbite. The walls of these halls were just as clever. At Stong in Iceland, archaeologists discovered that Viking builders used a 3-layered insulation system: outer wooden planks or wattle walls, an inner surface of stone or hide, and a middle layer packed with wool, moss, and animal hair. The gaps were filled with clay to seal drafts. In some cases, reflective stones were embedded inside, primitive heat mirrors that bounced warmth back into the room. Outside, the lower halves of the walls were buried in earth, creating a semi-subterranean effect that absorbed geothermal heat. Snow wasn't an enemy here, it was insulation. A metre-thick layer on the roof could boost interior warmth by nearly a third. Archaeological tests in reconstructed longhouses prove it. What looked primitive was in fact thermal genius. The longhouse didn't fight nature, it made an alliance with it. And the final secret wasn't made of wood or stone, it was made of flesh. Humans themselves were the longhouse's furnace. Each person generated about 100 watts of heat at rest. Multiply that by 40 bodies, plus cattle and sheep, and the interior became a living heat engine. The more life inside, the warmer the world became. In those winters, the community wasn't just emotional, it was thermodynamic. That's why Viking society revolved around proximity. The closer you were to others, the closer you were to survival. Sleeping platforms lined the walls, raised above the cold floor, their wooden slats covered in straw and furs. The richest or most respected slept near the central fire. The poor, the enslaved, the elderly, by the door. In a single glance you could see the social hierarchy of the Viking world laid out by temperature. Status wasn't written in gold, it was written in degrees of warmth. Even the air itself was part of the hierarchy. The upper layer, thick with smoke and heat, belonged to the hanging meat, the tools, the gods carved into beams. Below, humans crouched in the flickering light, wrapped in fur, whispering stories that held their sanity together. The senses would have been overwhelmed. The sting of wood smoke, the stench of sweat and dung, the constant drone of animals breathing beside you. A longhouse wasn't quiet. It was a living organism, snorting, coughing, whispering, creaking through the night as if it dreamed with you. Light was precious. Windows were covered with thin sheets of mica or stretched animal intestines, letting through a dull, ghostly glow. After dusk, oil lamps filled with fish oil smoked and sputtered, casting shadows that trembled like ghosts across the walls. In that dim world, a man could grow old without ever seeing true daylight from November to March. Privacy didn't exist. Life, death, sex, birth, illness, all happened in full view. The longhouse wasn't just a home, it was society in miniature. Every argument, every reconciliation, every decision about food or firewood was made within arm's reach of 40 others. Conflict had to be managed carefully. A wrong word in that closed space could shatter the fragile balance on which survival depended. So the Vikings developed something anthropologists call high-context communication, the art of understanding without speaking. A gesture, a silence, a tone carried more meaning than an argument. The sagas are filled with traces of this, moments where silence itself was strategy, where restraint was survival. In the darkness of the longhouse, words could start wars, but silence could save lives. The longhouse was also a workshop. Winter wasn't a time of rest, it was a season of creation. Loom weights, bone needles, iron tools, and spindle whirls found in these halls proved that the cold months were when industry flourished. Textiles were woven, weapons were repaired, trade goods were made ready for the spring voyages. Even in confinement, the Vikings remained in motion, turning despair into production. This was survival psychology in its purest form. Idleness was dangerous. It invited the mind to wander into darkness. The purpose, on the other hand, was heat. The more they worked, the more they belonged. Modern scientists studying isolation in polar regions have found the same truth the Vikings lived by. Work keeps madness away. When the world outside froze, the Vikings turned inward and built a civilization out of confinement. The longhouse then was more than timber and smoke. It was a cultural crucible, a womb of endurance where the Norse reinvented what it meant to be human. Within its walls, they learned the ultimate law of the North. Survival isn't a condition, it's a craft. And while the fire kept death from their doors, another enemy still stalked them: hunger. Food wasn't just survival, it was time itself. Every bite eaten too soon was a day stolen from spring. The old woman's hands moved slowly but precisely, tracing grooves worn into the wooden bowl from decades of use. Her fingers tremble, not from age but from hunger. She measures the day's ration of dried fish and barley by touch, alone. She doesn't need sight. She has done this ritual more times than she can remember. Around her, the longhouse watches in silence. No one complains. No one dares. The mathematics of survival is sacred, and she is its high priestess. In the Viking world, food wasn't nourishment. It was time. Every bite measured the distance between life and spring. The stores must last until the earth softens and the first shoots appear again. That could be weeks or months away. Outside, the world offers nothing but snow and silence. Inside, the community's fate depends on the precision of hands like hers. To the Vikings, food storage was not simply a task. It was a religion built from necessity. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered the physical remains of this devotion. At Coppergate in York and again in Jorvik, excavations revealed enormous storage pits, occupying up to a third of household space. Deep, lined with clay, and sealed with wax, these were not cellars. They were vaults, guarded as fiercely as treasure hoards. The Norse understood something modern people have forgotten. Food is civilization. Without it, law, loyalty, and love all collapse. Every settlement's survival was decided not in battle, but in the quiet labour of preserving enough to see another dawn. They used every method available to nature itself. Fish were split, gutted, and hung on wooden racks called hjell, exposed to the icy wind until they became hard as wood. These stockfish were nutritional miracles, light, dry, and able to last for years. Modern tests show some samples still preserved up to 80% of their protein after centuries. For the Norse, it was the perfect food for a world that tried to freeze them to death. To the Vikings, dried fish was more valuable than gold. It was the currency of survival. Meat followed the same logic, adapted by species. Pork was smoked, its fat sealed into barrels of salt. Beef and mutton were dried in smoke-thickened air until leathery and dark. In some longhouses, archaeologists found the bones of animals strung high in rafters, hung above the hearth where smoke drifted upward day and night. The same smoke that burned their eyes and lungs also preserved their next meal. Fermentation added yet another layer to this living science. Milk became skyer, thick, tangy, rich with protein. Cabbage turned to a Viking form of sauerkraut, packed in barrels to preserve what little vitamin C they could salvage. Grain was parched and stored dry, safe from mould and insects. Nothing went to waste. Everything became part of the cycle. Even rot was tamed. They turned decay into defence. The Norse approached nutrition like warriors approached strategy. They balanced proteins, fats, and carbohydrates through generations of observation. A handful of dried fish, a bowl of barley gruel, and a mouthful of fermented dairy could sustain a grown man for days. It wasn't culinary pleasure, it was biochemical wisdom encoded in tradition. Archaeological pollen studies reveal the intensity of this agricultural preparation. Fields near settlements were ploughed and harvested with military precision. Every grain was part of a social contract. The strong worked to store life for the weak, and in return, the weak endured to carry memory and culture forward. But storing food was only half the battle. The other half was deciding who would eat it. During winter, every meal became a moral test. The sagas hint at this in whispers, the unspoken tension at the communal table, where each portion was weighed not just in size, but in justice. Leaders had to distribute food according to honour, labour and necessity. Too much generosity invited death, too little invited rebellion. Excavations at Viking sites reveal standardised measuring tools, wooden cups, horn scoops and marked bowls, used exclusively for winter rationing. These objects weren't conveniences, they were instruments of order. They prevented jealousy, despair and chaos from tearing apart what starvation had not yet destroyed. When hunger ruled the north, fairness became its own form of weapon. The process of distribution itself was ritualised. Anthropologists believe the daily rationing ceremony, where elders measured and handed out food, served a psychological purpose. By making scarcity predictable, the Vikings made fear bearable. Everyone could see that hunger was shared equally, that no one ate in secret while others starved. In that act, they preserved not only life but trust, the most fragile resource of all. Still, no system was perfect. There came winters when even the best prepared settlements faced the impossible. Food stores dwindled before spring's thaw. In those moments, the Vikings turned to what scholars now call famine foods. Tree bark was stripped and boiled into bitter paste. Seaweed and lichen were scraped from frozen rocks. Even leather was softened in broth to release a trace of nutrition. Human remains from those winters tell the story in bone and tooth. Signs of starvation, malnutrition, and sheer desperation. When the land turned against them, the Vikings ate the world itself. But famine did more than test the body, it tested the soul. In some places, evidence suggests darker measures. Isotope studies reveal that in desperate years, food was directed toward those most vital to survival. The hunters, the mothers, the warriors. The weak sometimes went hungry, so the strong could keep the fire alive. And when even that wasn't enough, The sagas speak in veiled language of the ultimate sacrifice, the elders who walked into the snow, the infants given to the frost. Archaeological evidence from burial sites supports it. Some deaths coincide with severe climate years, their remains bearing the marks of exposure, not disease. To the Norse, this wasn't cruelty, it was calculus. They didn't believe in endless mercy, they believed in continuity. By losing a few, they saved the many. Survival wasn't about compassion, it was about continuity. This wasn't a culture without heart, it was a culture that understood the true price of existence. Even the grim act of selective survival was wrapped in ritual and reverence. Elders who chose death did so with ceremony. Infants lost to the frost were given symbolic burial rites when spring returned. These weren't murders, they were negotiations with nature itself. The Vikings also mastered the art of energy conservation, what modern biologists call metabolic management. During the deepest winter months, activity slowed to a crawl. Movements were measured, speech was sparse. Work was organised around tasks that required the least motion. The sagas describe it as sitting through the dark. This was survival by discipline. Every unnecessary gesture wasted heat. Every argument wasted breath. Children were taught early to distinguish between discomfort and true danger, to know that endurance was the first rule of life in the north. They didn't fight hunger, they befriended it, trained with it, learned its language. The Viking approach to starvation prevention was both technological and philosophical. Their granaries, pits and smokehouses were machines of survival, but their real innovation was psychological. They made hunger sacred. It became part of their identity, proof of worth. To be able to say, "I endured the long winter," was not a complaint. It was victory. Winter was the enemy that forged their unity. It tested not just their architecture or agriculture, but their very concept of humanity. And when darkness fell and their stores were rationed to crumbs, another war began, this time not against cold or hunger, but against the mind itself. The next battle the Vikings had to fight wasn't outside, it was in the dark. The storyteller's voice trembles through the smoke-thick air, each word glowing like a coal in the gloom. Children press close to the hearth, faces painted in red light and black shadow. Beyond the doorway lies oblivion, a void without stars, without sound, where even wolves have fallen silent. Inside this circle of fire, reality still exists. In a Viking winter, the hearth wasn't comfort. It was the edge of existence. The story is his weapon. As he speaks of Thor's battle with the frost giants, the listeners forget the storm outside. The tale is more than myth. It's medicine. In a world of eternal night, words themselves become fire. Darkness was the North's greatest predator. For months the sun refused to rise and time itself began to unravel. North of the Arctic Circle, day was only a memory. Even farther south, the light was thin, a grey bruise across the sky that faded before a man could finish his work. To the mind, this endless twilight was poison, a slow erasure of hope and rhythm. What happens to a mind when it no longer knows when the day begins or ends? Archaeology tells us the Vikings fought back with engineering and ritual. Fire was their primary tool, but it was also their most expensive resource. Every flame cost fuel. Every spark was paid for in sweat. Wood had to be hauled from frozen forests, dried and guarded like treasure. The longhouse hearth was never allowed to die. Its coals were banked under ash each night, then coaxed back to life at dawn. That continuity of flame meant continuity of life. When archaeologists excavated ancient hearths, they found the same layer of ash, years, sometimes decades, of unbroken fire. Wood was chosen like medicine, birch for bright light, pine for long heat, alder for slow coals. Each piece served a purpose. And yet even with perfect management, fire alone could not conquer darkness. It could only carve a small circle of defiance within it. To stretch the reach of their light, Vikings turned to innovation. Soapstone lamps burned seal or fish oil. their wicks fashioned from twisted moss. They gave off more smoke than glow, but they could burn through the night. Some were set into niches lined with polished metal or mica, bouncing light back into the room. Primitive mirrors in a world that had never seen glass. They couldn't summon the sun, so they learned to multiply its ghost. Candles were luxuries. Beeswax was rare, and tallow cost meat and fat better spent on survival. When candles did appear, they marked something sacred. A birth, a ceremony, or a night when despair needed chasing away. Light to the Norse wasn't convenience. It was divinity you could hold in your hand. Centuries later, skeletal remains from Viking cemeteries show enlarged eye sockets and increased rod cell density, signs of adaptation to perpetual dimness. Their eyes literally evolved to see in gloom. After weeks in low light, modern experiments prove that human night vision can improve sixfold. The Vikings didn't fear the dark, they became creatures of it. But their most powerful weapon against darkness wasn't physical, it was psychological. The sagas speak of long winters filled with stories, songs, and riddles. These weren't idle entertainments, they were structured therapy sessions for the soul. In the deepest months, storytellers became healers, keeping minds from breaking. When you can't escape the dark, you must learn to make it listen. Each tale had purpose. Some were journeys to warmer lands, reminding listeners that sunlight still existed. Others told of ancestors who survived worse winters, transforming terror into continuity. Storytelling wasn't escapism, it was survival programming, teaching every listener that endurance had meaning. Ritual provided the calendar that the sky had stolen. Vikings marked time through sound, smell, and memory. The creak of ice, the shifting of wind, the solstice feast of Yule. At that turning point of darkness, they didn't hide from the night. They confronted it head-on with fire, feasting, and song. Archaeologists have found traces of those festivals, piles of animal bones, shards of drinking horns, clusters of lampstones arranged in circular patterns. The people of the north didn't wait for light. They made their own, declaring to the void, "We are still here." Every flame lit at Yule was a declaration of war against despair. The hearth, meanwhile, governed both warmth and hierarchy. The closer you sat to the fire, the higher your worth. It wasn't arrogance, it was survival economics. The leader's family sat at the core, bathed in light. Servants, slaves, and the unwanted huddled near the doors, shivering where the cold leaked in. Yet winter could reorder even this system. When storytellers lifted morale, when craftspeople kept tools working, when healers calmed the sick, their value rose. Status could shift by usefulness. For a few dark months, skill became nobility. This merit born of necessity forged respect for knowledge, an early democracy of endurance. Even a slave who could predict the weather might earn a seat near the fire. In the dark season, wisdom burned brighter than bloodline. Fire itself took on a sacred life. Excavations show ceremonial hearth maintenance, ashes carefully layered, embers ritually stirred at lunar cycles, charms buried beneath stones. Flame was both technology and spirit, a companion that demanded offerings. When the final coals of one winter died, the first spark of spring was struck with ritual silence, as if greeting an old god returned from death. The Vikings didn't see light and darkness as opposites. They saw them as partners in a dialogue that shaped their souls. Without darkness, light had no meaning. Without struggle, warmth had no value. Modern life lets us banish the night with a switch, but in doing so, we've forgotten what the Vikings knew. Darkness is not the enemy. It is the forge where endurance is tempered and meaning is made. To master winter, the Vikings first mastered themselves. Their command of fire and light brought them another day of life, but outside the longhouse the cold still reigned. The next battle was fought not with flame, but with fur, leather, and human ingenuity. The invention of a portable fortress. Their clothing. The hunter moves like a shadow between trees. The air is so cold it squeals in his lungs. His breath bursts out in small clouds that freeze before they fade. The snow beneath his boots creaks, a sound sharper than breaking glass. Around him the forest glitters with frost so fine it looks alive. His face is raw, his eyelashes white with ice. Yet beneath all that cold, he is warm. The Vikings didn't just wear clothing, they wore survival. Every layer of his body tells a story of invention. Closest to the skin is linen, soft and dry, pulling sweat away before it can turn lethal. Over that, a thick woolen tunic traps air, nature's insulation. Above that, reindeer fur with hollow hairs holds warmth like a living creature. Finally, sealskin turns snow and water aside. The hunter's garments are not decorations. They are armour against the gods themselves. Archaeologists studying Viking textiles have found what modern engineers would call genius. Wool was the foundation of everything, the Viking version of modern performance fabric. But this wasn't crude material. Under microscopes, Viking wool reveals tightly scaled fibres that interlock when spun, forming tiny air pockets that trap heat. Their sheep were bred for survival. Their wool evolved for insulation. The result? Fabric that stayed warm, even when soaked through with melting snow. Before Gore-Tex, before nylon, the North already had its own technology. Vikings didn't just make clothing, they understood systems of layering. Their garments formed a complete ecosystem, one that worked in dialogue with the body. The linen-based layer absorbed sweat and released it quickly, keeping the skin dry. The middle layer of wool trapped warmth while allowing air to circulate. And the outer layer of fur or treated leather sealed out wind and moisture. It was a living microclimate, one that could mean the difference between life and a frozen corpse found in spring. Modern field tests with reconstructed Viking clothing prove their mastery. Fully dressed, a Viking could function for hours at minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, far below what an unprotected human could endure for even minutes. Every choice of material carried both logic and ritual. Wool was sacred to the goddess Frigg, protector of home and hearth. Leather was connected to Ulla, the god of hunting and winter. Furs, especially from foxes or reindeer, were not trophies but talismans, infused with the spirit of the animal that had once resisted the cold. To wear another creature's fur was not vanity, it was a pact with nature's survivors. Reindeer fur was the jewel of this technology. Its hollow hairs trapped heat so efficiently that even the Arctic Sami used it centuries later for survival. Fox fur, lightweight and soft, lined hoods and collars, protecting the skin from frostbite. Seal and beaver pelts, treated with animal oils, turned water like stone. And wool, ever present, ever adaptable, was spun into endless forms: cloaks, hats, mittens, leggings, even socks. Shoes were marvels of necessity. Archaeologists have found reversible leather footwear from Hedeby and Oseberg, stitched so they could be worn with either side facing outward. In summer, the smooth grain faced out to repel water. In winter, the rough flesh side gripped snow and held insulation. Inside, wool wrappings cushioned the feet, sometimes stuffed with dry grass for extra warmth. The feet were the first line of defence against the frost, and the Vikings treated them with reverence. Every step was a negotiation with death. Hands and heads came next in the hierarchy of warmth. Mittens, not gloves, dominated Viking winterwear because fingers shared heat more efficiently when kept together. Archaeologists have recovered layered mittens, inner wool, outer leather, and fur at the wrist. The wrists, rich with blood vessels close to the skin, were guarded like treasure. The same principle shaped their hoods, tight-fitting linen caps under heavy fur, sealing warmth at the neck where blood flow could betray the body's core. To the Vikings, dressing for winter was more than a daily task. It was ritual armour assembly. Each layer represented foresight, community effort, and ancestral wisdom. A single garment could require days of spinning, weaving, and sewing, often performed collectively. Women, men, even children contributed to the weaving of survival. Textile production was not a gendered chore. It was sacred work. In the dim light of the longhouse, loom weights clinked softly, rhythmic as prayer. The spinning of wool was a song against despair. Every thread was a small rebellion against the cold. The Vikings wove not just fabric, they wove courage. And they decorated it, even when beauty had no practical purpose. Intricate borders, coloured dyes, and patterns appeared on garments made only to be hidden beneath fur. Tablet-woven bands carried protective runes. Triangular stitches invoked Thor's hammer or the Valknut, symbols of strength and endurance. Even in suffering, they found room for art, because beauty, too, was survival. In a season that stripped the world to black and white, colour became defiance. A red cloak, a gold brooch, or blue-dyed threads weren't vanity. They were psychological warmth, reminders that life was still vibrant under the snow. Archaeological evidence even shows the Vikings maintained these garments obsessively. Furs were re-oiled, wool retreated with lanolin, seams mended each winter evening by firelight. The work itself was hope made visible. The North devoured the careless. Only those who respected their clothing lived to see spring. What's striking about the Viking approach to cold wasn't just their materials, it was their philosophy. They saw winter not as something to defeat, but as something to collaborate with. They didn't curse the cold, they learned its language. Their clothing didn't fight nature, it imitated it. Fur, wool, leather, all borrowed the strategies of animals that had already mastered survival. Modern outdoor experts still rely on the same principles the Vikings lived by. Layer, insulate, protect the extremities, and let the body's own heat become the hearth. But for the Norse, this wasn't theory, it was theology. Warmth itself was sacred, a spark of divine order against the chaos of frost. When the longhouse door opened and the wind howled in, a properly dressed Viking stepped into it, not as prey, but as an equal. Wrapped in layers of craft and meaning, he was part human, part element, a walking covenant between life and winter. For the Vikings, warmth wasn't comfort, it was victory. And yet, no matter how perfect their clothing or clever their fire, survival required something even greater: belief. Because when the body reached its limit, only the mind could keep the spirit from breaking. And in the deepest months of the year, when the sun was dead and the world seemed cursed, the Vikings turned to something older and more powerful than any flame: faith. The vulva lifts her carved staff, its bronze rings chiming softly in the firelight. Around her, the longhouse is silent except for the low moan of wind through the rafters. Her eyes are clouded white, but she sees what others cannot. Smoke rises, curling like spirits above the hearth. The people wait, hollow from hunger, frightened by the sickness creeping through the livestock. They need guidance. They need proof that the gods still listen. In the dead of winter, faith wasn't luxury, it was oxygen. She begins to chant. The sound isn't speech, but vibration, half breath, half thunder. The trance spreads like warmth. Even the children go still. In her voice, the community hears something older than fear. The vulva is the bridge between worlds. Her words the only fire bright enough to reach the other side. The Norse didn't separate survival from spirituality. To them, the gods weren't distant. They lived inside storms, in rivers frozen under moonlight, in the smoke of the hearth. Every gust of wind was Odin's whisper, every creaking beam, a spirit's warning. Where modern people see weather, the Vikings saw will. When the world itself wants you dead, belief becomes the art of negotiation. Their concept of weird, fate, was not blind destiny but a web that could be touched, altered and felt. During the longest nights they cast runes, read bones, and sought patterns in flame. Archaeologists have found runestones marked with midwinter dates, used to predict when the sun would return. Each reading wasn't prophecy, it was psychology. By giving form to uncertainty, they made fear manageable. Winter, to the Norse, was the season when the boundaries between worlds thinned. The dead walked nearer, the gods listened closer, and the living learned humility. Excavations at Hofstadr in Iceland uncovered winter-specific ritual spaces, altars surrounded by animal bones and carved idols blackened by soot. This was no ordinary religion. It was survival magic written in blood and smoke. They didn't pray for comfort, they bargained for existence. During these ceremonies, the vulva wasn't a performer, she was an instrument. The rhythmic chant, the flicker of firelight, the scent of burning herbs, all worked together to alter consciousness. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Norse instinctively knew. Rhythm and repetition can change brain states, dull hunger, and even reduce pain. Their magic wasn't an illusion, it was early psychology. And at the centre of that psychological defence stood a single celebration, Jul Yule, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The turning point when darkness had devoured nearly everything, and only faith held it back. When the sun vanished, the Vikings threw a feast for the darkness. Archaeologists have unearthed layers of ash and bone from Yule feasts, evidence of slaughter, sacrifice, and unrestrained consumption. For one night, rationing laws broke. Fires blazed brighter. Mead flowed. The people of the north defied despair by acting as if plenty still existed. To modernise, it might look reckless. To them, it was medicine. They believed that generosity summoned the returning light. Light, food, laughter. Each became a weapon against despair. Every torch kindled at Yule was a promise that the sun would rise again. When the sky outside remained black, the Vikings built suns of their own. Their festivals weren't celebrations, they were counterattacks. Personal faith too took on winter form. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer increased in frequency during the coldest months, as did charms dedicated to Skadi, the goddess of winter and the hunt. These were not trinkets of superstition, they were psychological anchors, tangible proof that protection still existed. Excavations at sacrificial sites show that during winter, offerings became more personal. A silver ring, a child's carved toy, a rare piece of meat. Giving away value in times of scarcity wasn't madness. It was defiance. It restored control. In that transaction with the divine, fear became a choice. In their darkest hour, the Vikings found power in surrender. Spiritual specialists like the Völva travelled between settlements through snow and ice, carrying not just prophecy, but morale. Their presence was a reminder that meaning still connected scattered communities. Burials of these women show staff capped with iron, pouches of herbs and fragments of amber, objects believed to trap light itself. They were the torch-bearers of a world in shadow. Death, ever near in winter, was not the end of participation. The Vikings believed ancestors remained close, watching and guiding. Their spirits could bless or punish, depending on how the living behaved. Many households kept ancestor stones or wooden effigies near the hearth, feeding them a share of food each night. To neglect them was to invite famine. Even the dead had to be fed in the land of hunger. This relationship with the unseen transformed grief into structure. If someone died during winter, the body might wait months before burial, but their spirit was immediately woven into the community's defence. The boundary between living and dead was a conversation, not a wall. These rituals served more than faith, they preserved mental health. Modern studies of isolated communities confirm what the Norse practiced. Shared ceremonies reduce anxiety, create cohesion, and replace chaos with pattern. Their myths and magic weren't primitive, they were neurochemical warfare against despair. When the sun finally returned in late winter, it was met not with surprise, but with triumph. The community had kept its side of the bargain. Through ritual, restraint, and shared purpose, they had kept the world turning. The light didn't save them, they saved it. The spiritual endurance of the Vikings was not blind belief. It was a strategy. They learned that meaning could warm what fire could not. In that truth lies the secret to their survival. When the body faltered, faith carried what flesh could not bear. And yet even faith had limits. The gods could not thaw frozen ground, or ease the weight of death that winter always demanded. The next test would be the cruelest of all, facing loss in a land too hard to bury the dead. The fire could comfort the living, but who comforted the frozen dead? The hammer strikes once, dull against ice-hard earth. The sound doesn't echo. It vanishes, swallowed by snow. A small crowd stands around the pit, wrapped in furs stiff with frost. Their breath rises like ghosts. At their feet lies a body sewn into a shroud of wool and hide, its eyelashes rimed with frost, its hair glazed with ice. The priest murmurs a final verse, voice trembling from the cold more than grief. In Viking lands, even death had to wait its turn. The ground is iron. No blade, no spade, no will can break it. So the dead remain above ground, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until the thaw returns. They rest in barns, in lean-tos, in small huts known later as Dauderhus, houses of the dead. Archaeologists have uncovered them near Icelandic farms, crude log shelters sealed with turf, their interiors lined with straw. Inside, the stillness is absolute. The living visit daily, lighting oil lamps to keep frost from consuming the faces of those they loved. They speak to them as if they still listened, and perhaps they believed they did. When you cannot bury the body, you keep talking to the soul. This grim arrangement served practical and spiritual purposes. The frozen soil made burial impossible, but it also created time to say goodbye, to arrange the rites properly, to ensure the spirit crossed safely into the next world. The Vikings believed that if a corpse was neglected, its soul could wander, restless, cold and angry. These droga, the undead of Norse legend, were not monsters from imagination. They were warnings born from winter itself. Every unburied body was a potential haunting, and so care was sacred. The dead were washed in melted snow, wrapped in clean cloth, adorned with small possessions, a comb, a brooch, a knife. Wealth didn't matter, recognition did. Even in poverty, the dead were treated with ceremony, because ritual gave shape to grief. Death without ritual was more terrifying than death itself. Archaeological evidence supports these acts of devotion. At Birka and Oseberg, researchers have found preserved flowers, yarrow, mugwort, and meadowsweet, laid beside the dead, frozen fragments of colour in a monochrome world. These weren't decorations, they were prayers in plant form, symbols of rebirth waiting under the snow. Yet some winters overwhelm even ritual. In famine years, when bodies outnumbered places to keep them, the Vikings turned to the sea. A funeral boat might be dragged onto frozen water, set aflame when ice permitted. The flames reflected on the fjord like a second sun. Such scenes echo through sagas and modern archaeology alike. Ashes mingled with charred wood, scattered across coastal grave sites. When earth refused the dead, the sea became their coffin. The symbolism ran deep. The sea was the pathway to every other world, Midgard to Asgard, life to death. To return a body to the waves wasn't surrender, it was released. The ocean that had sustained them in life would carry them safely into myth. But for most, death was quieter. Families kept vigil beside the body through long nights, telling stories that folded the dead back into the living. Grief was never private. It was shared, channeled through narrative. To forget the dead was to weaken the community's spine. Every name repeated by firelight became a form of immortality. When at last the thaw came, the burial began. Men swung axes to break the softened crust. Women gathered offerings, food, jewellery, the first green shoots. The grave itself was a conversation between permanence and mercy. In Norway, mounds rose like frozen waves over the landscape, each one marking a human life that had refused to vanish. Their cemeteries were not fields of sorrow, they were maps of endurance. Some graves were aligned to the sunrise, awaiting light's return. Others faced west, toward the unseen realm of the dead. The Vikings buried their people not to separate them, but to station them, as guardians, as witnesses, as proof that survival was possible. The soil they entered was not enemy ground but ancestral memory, the same dirt their descendants would one day fight to live upon. Inside these graves, archaeologists have found weapons and tools, spinning whorls and beads, fragments of fur and wool. Every object was chosen with precision, a final dialogue between the living and the departed. You fought, you built, you endured. Take these with you to continue your work. And perhaps the most haunting detail lies in what they sometimes buried last. A burning coal, placed near the chest. A spark from the home fire, offered so the dead would not enter the next world cold. Even at the end, they refused to let their dead freeze. The Norse understanding of mortality was not despair. It was discipline. Death was inevitable, but neglect was a sin. By caring for the dead, they reaffirmed life. Every burial, every mound, every flame on frozen ground was a declaration. We remember, therefore we endure. As winter wore on, each mound under snow became both a warning and promise. Beneath it slept those who had earned rest. Above it trudged those who had yet to. In that tension, the dialogue between living warmth and frozen silence, lay the essence of the Viking soul. In a land that could kill them at any moment, the Vikings learned to bury fear before they buried their dead. And still one more trial remained, the hardest of all. Because when the dead were honoured and the food was gone, when the fire burned low and the wind screamed across the fjords, the living had to decide who among them would see the next sunrise. The fire burns low, a single orange eye staring out from the hearth. Around it, the longhouse breathes like a sleeping beast, slow, heavy, exhausted. Every creak of timber sounds like a groan from the earth itself. In one corner, a mother hums softly to a child wrapped in wool and fur. The lullaby is not sweet, it is a warding spell. The words promise nothing except endurance. In Viking winter, love was not gentle, it was ruthless. To bring a child into that world was an act of courage and calculation. Life itself was a gamble against the elements. Infants were born in the same smoky halls where animals slept and elders coughed. There was no sterile quiet, only fire, blood, and breath steaming in the cold air. A newborn's first sound wasn't always a cry. Sometimes it was silent, and silence in winter was a decision. Survival began with the smallest heartbeat, and sometimes ended before it started. The sagas whisper of utburder, the exposure of unwanted or doomed infants. It was not murder in the eyes of the Old Norse. It was released, a grim equation written in frost. Archaeological layers and saga accounts hint that when food failed, or deformity threatened survival, the weak were returned to the earth. Their souls, the old women said, would find a quicker rebirth in warmer times. Modern judgment cannot touch this truth without misunderstanding it. These were not monsters, but pragmatists in a world that punished mercy. To the Vikings, compassion wasn't measured by sentiment. It was measured by endurance. A family that perished helping one fragile life did not save anyone. It doomed them all. In the north, mercy could kill faster than the cold. Yet those who survived infancy were treated as miracles. Childhood in the Viking Age was short, but it burned bright. From the moment they could walk, children became workers, hauling wood, feeding livestock, spinning wool, or fetching water through snow tunnels taller than themselves. Play existed, but play was training. Wooden swords, toy longships, carved animals, each was a lesson in strength, precision, or the art of endurance. Archaeologists have found miniature tools and child-sized axes buried near settlements, not as toys, but as symbols. Even the smallest hands were expected to carry the weight of survival. Every child was both a burden and a promise, a living investment in the next Thor. In the Viking world, innocence froze first. Elders faced the opposite end of that same brutal spectrum. In youth, strength was the purpose. In age, weakness was danger. There was no retirement in the north. Every mouth had to earn its share. As long as an elder could mend nets, weave rope, or tell stories that steadied hearts, they were precious. But when illness or frailty made even that impossible, a dark choice loomed. The sagas and oral legends preserve these whispers, of old men walking into the snow, of widows leaving the longhouse before dawn. The act was called Ferd ut I kulda, the journey into the cold. It was not forced exile, but a voluntary farewell. The belief was that by returning one's life to the frost willingly, the gods would spare the family the curse of starvation. To die by choice was to turn death into a final act of love. Archaeological evidence supports some of these stories. At several Norse sites, skeletons of elders are found in shallow graves, away from main burial grounds. Their positions peaceful, unguarded. No signs of violence, only solitude. The sagas call them heroes of a quiet kind, the ones who met the cold so others didn't have to. The psychology behind these customs was not cruelty, it was coherence. Everyone in the longhouse understood their place in the grand arithmetic of survival. Death was not always tragedy, sometimes it was duty. And yet the emotional cost ran deep. Songs from later centuries in Iceland preserved the laments of daughters who dreamt of their mothers, standing in the snow with open arms. Even acceptance could not erase grief. They learned to honour sorrow without letting it weaken them. Inside the longhouse, respect for age was still profound. Elders were the keepers of memory, the living libraries of knowledge. They carried oral history, weather patterns, medicinal recipes, and the stories of gods that had held the community together for generations. Even when their bodies failed, their voices fed the tribe. To lose an elder before they passed on their wisdom was a disaster. That's why winter evenings became classrooms. Children gathered around the hearth, listening to tales that mixed myth and manual. How to read the ice, when to sow barley, what herbs to boil for fever. These stories weren't fiction. They were survival manuals disguised as poetry. In the dark, words became inheritance. Generational bonds were the secret infrastructure of Viking life. The young supplied strength, the old supplied reason. Both were necessary to endure what no individual could face alone. When one fell, the other carried the flame. And that flame was literal. The final duty of the elderly was often to tend the hearth, the last act of warmth they could still control. When they died, someone else took their place at the fire, ensuring the cycle never broke. Life in the north was a relay, not a race. The price of survival was constant sacrifice, but it also produced something rare, solidarity born not from comfort, but from shared struggle. In the Viking world, every breath taken in winter was an act of cooperation across generations. So when a child survived its first year, when an elder saw one more sunrise, it wasn't a chance, it was the outcome of hundreds of small decisions made by a tribe that refused to break. Their strength was never individual. It was inherited, shared, and renewed every time the longhouse fire refused to die. But beyond the labour, beyond the rituals, and beyond the sacrifices, something even greater kept them alive, the mind itself. Because in the end, no fire or fur could save a person whose spirit had already frozen. The storm outside never ends. It howls like something alive, pressing its cold mouth against the wooden walls. Inside, the longhouse is nearly silent. The fire has burned down to coals. Faces glow red in the dimness. No one speaks, but everyone listens. To the wind, to their own thoughts, to the thin thread of sanity stretched between them. The greatest enemy of the Viking winter wasn't the cold, it was the mind. Cold kills the body slowly, but hopelessness kills it faster. The Vikings knew this long before science gave it a name. They lived in a world that tested not just the strength of flesh, but the architecture of the human spirit. Their psychology was their shield. Modern researchers studying polar explorers, soldiers, and isolated communities have discovered what the Norse lived by instinct. Endurance is a mental art. The body endures what the mind accepts. When deprivation becomes routine, the only way to survive is to reshape the meaning of suffering. The Vikings didn't escape hardship, they redefined it. From birth, they were trained to see pain not as punishment, but as proof. Cold was not a curse, it was the teacher of resilience. Hunger was not failure, it was the measure of strength. Every ordeal became an opportunity to prove worth, both to oneself and to the gods. The sagas reflect this mental conditioning. Heroes rarely cry out in agony. Instead, they describe their suffering with dark humour or silence. To the modern ear, this sounds stoic. but to the Norse it was sacred. Control over one's reaction to pain was a form of power. If you could not master the world, you could still master yourself. To the Vikings, silence wasn't weakness, it was dominance over despair. Anthropologists call this mindset adaptive fatalism. The Norse believed fate, weird, was woven before birth, but within that pattern lay freedom. The freedom to choose how one met what was coming. That single choice. Response was the root of dignity. We cannot change our doom, one saga says, but we can meet it laughing. Their laughter wasn't joy, it was rebellion. It was a psychological weapon, turning fear into theatre, misfortune into the story. This is why even their mythology mirrors resilience. Gods doomed to die at Ragnarok still fight anyway. Existence itself was resistance. The Norse didn't believe in happy endings, they believed in worthy battles. This worldview created astonishing mental endurance. Archaeological evidence shows entire communities rebuilt after fires, famines, or floods, often in the same place, as if daring the gods to strike again. Their resilience was physical, but it started in the mind, a refusal to give nature the satisfaction of their despair. Inside the longhouse, that mindset took form through ritual and repetition. Every winter morning began the same way, tending the fire, counting rations, checking the livestock. Routine became religion. Psychologists today know that structure prevents mental collapse in isolation. The Vikings lived that truth. Order was their therapy. And when structure failed, the story took its place. Each saga, each myth told by firelight was a form of cognitive endurance. The story reminded them that others had faced the same horrors and lived to tell them. In that retelling, trauma became legacy. A people who can turn suffering into a story can never be truly conquered. They also understood community psychology better than most modern societies. In the longhouse, despair was contagious, but so was courage. If one person panicked, the rest could falter. If one person steadied themselves, others found their rhythm again. Survival was emotional teamwork. This is why leadership in the Viking world wasn't defined only by strength, but by calm. The Godi or chieftain was expected to remain composed even when disaster struck. His steadiness was more valuable than his sword. In that sense, Viking leadership was proto-psychological. The ability to regulate the emotions of an entire group through posture, tone, and restraint. The calmest man in the storm became the anchor of the tribe. Modern neuroscience confirms what the Vikings practiced intuitively. Emotion regulates endurance. When fear takes over, blood flow shifts from brain to muscle. Decision-making collapses. But when calm prevails, even limited resources feel sufficient. The Viking belief in fate paradoxically reduced fear. If destiny was already written, panic served no purpose. Only action did. This belief gave them clarity in chaos. When the longship cracked under waves or the roof sagged under snow, there was no frenzy, only movement. Acceptance sharpened focus. The Norse didn't waste energy on the impossible. They worked with what remained. Acceptance, not optimism, was their secret strength. And beneath that acceptance flowed something deeper still, meaning. Every hardship, no matter how cruel, was part of a story that mattered. The cosmos itself had purpose, even if it ended in fire and frost. This belief made even suffering bearable, because it was never meaningless. Modern psychologists studying endurance call this logotherapy, finding purpose in pain. Viktor Frankl would describe it centuries later. The Vikings had practiced it a millennium before. Their lives proved that meaning doesn't erase suffering, it transforms it into direction. In that transformation lay their greatness. They didn't conquer the world because they were stronger or crueler. They conquered it because they were trained to endure what others couldn't imagine. The body breaks. The spirit decides when. When spring finally came, it wasn't joy that filled their hearts. It was vindication. The survivors emerged from their longhouses blinking in the first sunlight, thin but alive, carrying the fire in their eyes. They had stared into the abyss, and refused to vanish. Their minds had become as tempered as their swords, shaped by cold, hammered by fear, sharpened by repetition, and finally cooled in silence. To live through a Viking winter was to undergo a kind of psychological forging. The weak metal of comfort was burned away, leaving only steel. And that steel would soon cross oceans, build kingdoms, and carve its name into history. They didn't just survive winter, they became the weapon it forged, because endurance was never the absence of suffering. It was the mastery of it. The Vikings learned the oldest lesson of the North, that true power doesn't come from the body or the gods, it comes from within. And for those who lived through that endless dark, every heartbeat, every flame, every breath of thawing air was proof of one eternal truth. The greatest victory is not in conquering the world, but in surviving it. Spring doesn't arrive in the north, it returns slowly, like a promise hesitantly kept. The snow softens first in silence. Rivers crack, groaning like ancient doors reopening. The air tastes different, carrying the faint scent of soil instead of iron. After months of monochrome, colour bleeds back into the world. Green, gold, the impossible blue of open sky. From the longhouses emerge the survivors, faces lean, hands scarred, eyes unreadable. They blink in the sun as though seeing it for the first time. The light feels wrong, too bright, too loud, but then the warmth hits their skin, and a deep, almost animal joy rises from their chests. They made it. After half a year of darkness, the miracle wasn't that they lived, it's that they never stopped believing they could. The first tasks of spring aren't celebration, they're resurrection. Fires are relit outdoors, nets are mended, graves are finished. The longhouse doors are flung wide, letting in fresh air that smells like forgiveness. Everywhere life begins again, but slower, wiser, humbler. Those who endured the winter are no longer the same people who entered it. The cold has scraped away vanity and illusion. In its place stands something raw and honest, a mind that has met its own edge and stepped beyond. To survive the Viking winter was to meet yourself and not look away. Archaeologists can still trace the rhythm of those winters in soil layers and bone chemistry. But what they cannot measure is the transformation inside each human being, the invisible inheritance of resilience passed down through centuries. We carry fragments of it still. The instinct to prepare, to hoard, to light candles against the dark, all are echoes of that ancient war between warmth and oblivion. Modern life has softened us. We fear discomfort the way our ancestors feared famine. Yet somewhere, buried under convenience and electricity, the same capacity remains. The will to endure. The Vikings remind us that comfort isn't what made us human. Struggle did. We are all descended from people who refused to die in the dark. When we look back at their world, its brutality, its hunger, its endless night, it's easy to feel distance. But look closer and you see a mirror. The fears are the same, only colder. The courage, the same, only quieter. What they faced with fire and faith, we face now with anxiety and doubt. The conditions have changed, but the battle remains. And so their story isn't just history, it's instruction. The Vikings didn't conquer winter by brute force, they conquered it through meaning. They understood that endurance isn't just about the body's strength, but the soul's purpose. Every night survived had to matter, every dawn had to justify the suffering. Survival without purpose is just a slower kind of dying. If we could bring one lesson from their world into ours, it would be this. Comfort is temporary, but resilience is eternal. You don't need to live through blizzards to understand their wisdom. You only need to face your own darkness with the same resolve. Because in every human life comes a winter, the moment when warmth seems gone, when the world feels silent, when survival becomes a question of will. And when that moment arrives, remember the people of the North. Remember the smoke, the cold, the endless night, and the fire that never went out. They didn't just survive the hardest winters in history, they became the warmth that carried humanity through it. The Vikings' story is not about conquest, it's about endurance. about the quiet, stubborn miracle of life refusing to end. And in that defiance, in that shared human heartbeat, across 1,000 years, lies our truest kinship with them. Would you have survived a Viking winter? Would you have walked into the cold or kept the fire alive? Comment which city you're watching from, and let us know. Subscribe for more Viking history brought back to life, because the North still whispers through us, and its message is simple: endure.